Thank you very much. So, starting this talk, I realized so far from the speakers, I'm probably the only one that's going to speak about Eastern Europe, more or less. But I'm starting this today on the 11th of September with the glasses of Salvador Allende as they're sculptured in Caracas's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And in a way, my talk is going to be about a tale of two socialisms. You know, we can speak of today as the meaningful coincidence of this date with the US regime's military effort unraveling in Afghanistan. But we can also think of today as the commemoration of the 1973 coup, supported by the US, against democratic socialism in Salvador Allende's Chile. And what I'm going to speak about, which is quite a biographical also reflection on how a scholar of activism becomes more of a scholar activist through personal experience, is also a call not to romanticize that one or other socialist regimes which had their own weaknesses and vulnerabilities, but to remember the promises, intentions, and movements that brought these experiments to being, and the alternative routes history might have taken were they not crushed by capitalism. So, I was born in Pleven, but I was brought up on the Salvador Allende Boulevard in Sofia, which was later renamed after Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov. This monument on the Rhode Island was later overtaken by a business office and a betting shop and casino. I was educated in liberal public institutions in Bulgaria in the 1990s and 2000s, where the only way that you could speak about socialism was to call it totalitarian and to deny its existence en gros, instead of thinking of what were the redemptive and what were the negative parts of it, and what we could learn from this experience. But I was also, as many of us in those days, coming from a more theoretical background into social sciences, with a question that was one of the study of presence of absence or of deficits, which was back then, why we don't have a strong civil society in Eastern Europe. This is what later Agnes Gard, like a Hungarian anthropologist and sociologist, and myself have been speaking of in our shared and separate work about the normativity of the West in our part of the world, where this self-orientalizing view of permanent backwardness and catching up has also meant that we have to always think of what's lacking, and which is now a narrative that still, sadly, we have an aftertaste for in the West. There's something always better, bigger, faster, more, and it's usually what happens in Spain nowadays, or what happened with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, or there is always something, as Matan earlier said, in Bolivia that's kind of more exotic and better, and it's very often that we don't look what's happening in our own context, and it is not because we can't, but because this normativity is what we have been brought up with very strongly. And so my first study was actually of Czech dissidents, and of, you would probably know this picture, Václav Havel is to the right. So what I was really interested in increasingly was the real life utopias of, academics, intellectuals, what were their visions of a better society. And one thing that I was coming to terms with, starting to study literature on socialist utopias or socialist movements, was the question of why we always speak of moments like Paris in 1968 as very, kind of a promise for revolution and liberation, but we very often don't speak about Prague in 68 in the same way, or of Hungary in 56, or of Poland in 81. And so I remember encountering back in the day Rudi Dutschke's words to Jack Rupnik soon before he died, Dutschke. So he said, in retrospect, the great event of '68 in Europe was not Paris, but Prague. But we were unable to see this at the time. Now, he was by no stretch of imagination an anti-communist. This I can assure you. Why was it important? And what was happening in Eastern Europe at that time? So, what came in the literature in the early 2000s was that the greatness of this moment was connected to the grassroots practices of civil societies in kitchens, cellars, flying university seminars in remote locations. They were connected to a few individuals. Nowadays, we think of them as, they were mostly university-educated, able-bodied white males, which the West called dissidents, and this term somehow stuck. Of course, they weren't only always male, mostly white, mostly university-educated still. Those are the ones that we still have in our social memory. And so, what I found out in my first engagement with their work was that a lot of time they were using the tribune that Western NGOs, left and right activists gave them to demand social change, and to say that they wanted to change the terms of dialogue and to say that those most vulnerable are to be listened to. They were the most vulnerable. And that they were the ones that had to speak truth because they spoke out of bare existence. Now, of course, to do that under the pretext of civil society is a bit contradictory if we go back to Marx, because, as we know, in Marxist terms, civil society is bürgerliche Gesellschaft. So it is first and foremost an institution enabling the protection by the state of the market freedom for those who own the means of production and private property. In Eastern Europe, civil society became something else. It became society against the state. So the civility and peacefulness was linked to the European civilization and modernity, or, as Milan Kundera said, because what is Europe if not Europe of the small nations, ergo Central Europe? So the same way Havel and other Czech, Hungarian, and other dissidents, wherever they were even allowed, were making this claim of life in truth. And truth meant the right to speak against state socialist power, but not the right to speak against the market. And I think we have to bear this in mind. For now, we will come back to that. So, it was interesting for me the way that I took the next step into that journey through anthropology, to listen, for instance, to what other authors had to say about civil society. Most importantly, to think of what Partha Chatterjee had to say, where civil society is an instrument of the upper class to secure its position and channel its interests through the state. Meanwhile, what he called political society is the ever more alienated surplus population in constant severe crisis of social reproduction and abandon, and for whom the only path to gain recognition of or solution to their immediate problems is violence and localized action. There was another 1999. It happened in Venezuela. On the 27th of February 1999, days after the new election, the then second-term Prime Minister, Carlos Andrés Pérez, signed the Washington Consensus, which immediately resulted in cuts to public funding, and the first utility that was affected was gasoline for public use. People went angry, more than everything, because the social contract in a petrol country is that people don't have to pay for oil for public consumption. But it also meant that a lot of people that were living already under the threshold of poverty could not bear anymore. So the last straw had broken the camel's back. These are remembered as food riots. They usually didn't make it downtown. They were looting of shops, and burning of infrastructure. There was a lot of burning as well and blockades of means of transport in peripheral neighborhoods. And barricades, they were violently smashed by the police. The death count is still not known because there are still bodies that are found under, mass graves. And, but that is so importantly for me, and for what I'm trying to speak about here, is that this was called the beginning of the Fourth World War by Venezuelan intellectual Luis Brito Garcia, who said that so the First World War and the Second we know, the third is the Cold War, and the fourth one is not fought by armies, but it is the wretched of the earth against the owners of the means of production and against neoliberal governance. I did go to Venezuela for my fieldwork, not because of the first story, not because of the last story, but because of the first one. I was really interested to see what happens to radical intellectuals when they come to power and use a tool as a university in order to perform social change. Because what the big contradiction is there is first that people that are previously anti-authoritarians have to enter state power and gain recognition. But secondly, what happens to those who are proponents of egalitarian reform that challenges their privileges? And that is what happens to intellectuals many times when they come to power and propose, for instance, massification of higher education. I can speak more about what I found, that some take-home lessons would be that the old guard of the left did not get rid of their privilege that often, but transformed it into a revolutionary capital that was then used to push back any internal rectification. There was also a first generation into higher education who became the new educators. They gained social mobility, but were all the time shamed as being the new middle class. A lot of them are nowadays in migration in other Latin American countries. And then the third kind of important for me finding there that I'm still carrying along, and for which I had to start more and more reading social reproduction theory, was that this everyday revolution was carried on the shoulder of women, often adult learners and beneficiaries of social programs, often single mothers and workers. They did 4 shifts because that also included their political activism in different roles. They had a lot of political agency that was given by this regime, but they were also still suffering the hangover of economic marginalization. And so coming back home with these lessons, I came to Europe in 2008-11, so I was coming and going. And I found my own country in an immense crisis of social reproduction. Bulgaria was, in 2012-2013, in a situation where the increase of electricity had produced an enormous tension in society. Over 15 men, mostly, fathers of indebted families, committed suicide through self-immolation, so they burned themselves. And at the same time, there was a very strong liberal narrative that, despite the fact that we could mobilize maybe kind of anti-corruption protests with thousands, we should not be against increase of fees for electricity. This was a social cause, whereas we are civil. We need to fight for civil causes, and civil causes are not economic causes. So these people that went on the street, and there were many more waves of protests that followed, for economic causes were all the time shamed. So me and others in Bulgaria and in the region, in a small newborn left at that point, started trying to kind of counter this narrative. And we've still been doing that since then, and that's why many of us know me, and I know you from other activist events. But it's not been very easy, obviously. And I think some things that come from my previous experiences and research was, well, we were having to deal with a few contradictions ourselves. We were left under a shadow of a so-called totalitarian left, which had today transformed into oligarchic neoliberal hardcore parties. we were also, had to be kind of very inward looking and to solve immense problems that were not at the scale where we were working. We had to speak about the reforms of mass privatization and dismantlement of industries, agriculture and public services, political and economic ransom of a merged state capital organized crime nexus. And then there was also mass migration, on which survival of the whole society depends, soaring household debt and insecurity. So we also, however, and this a bit like the dissidents that I showed previously, were kind of having another problem. So this is, Bulgaria mourning some of these men who committed suicide by self-immolation. But in this time, many of us were not in Bulgaria because we were called by the Western left for the first time recognized. We were big, we could speak to big conferences where people could recognize us as really radical. So a lot of this was kind of reproducing this narrative of the dissidents that could be recognized by the West for whatever we're doing, and we're looking for that recognition as if it were going to solve some problems at home. But in the meantime, for me and for many of us, this crisis of social reproduction was coming it was hitting closer home, it was getting closer to the bone. So I was myself finishing a PhD and I was beginning a precarious career in academia, which some of us do in academia, others in NGO activism and so forth. And it was pushing me further afield because there were no jobs where I wanted to be. It was also kind of creating this difficulty to connect to others because we were always moving around. And I ended up, by irony of fate at that moment, in Ireland, where I studied precarity in academia. And so the one thing that I was finding out was that, beyond the crisis of, let's say, representation, redistribution, respect, and recognition that precarious academics were facing, we were facing a shortage of time between contracts, always trying to get into new applications, shortage of space and belonging by the constant moving, and thus the impossibility to mobilize ourselves, and lack of ability to plan ahead and think in the mid and the long term. So there was always more of a sense of these peripheral riots where you can't even make it to the center of power, but you try to do something locally and you extinguish very quickly, and then you're on the next contract. Of course, it's not that visceral, but it was very much felt by many of us, and that is how PrecAnthro was established and here brought to the center from the periphery of the European Association of Social Anthropology, of which I was back then just a member. And one thing that we found through much work, including a survey that we did with Martin Fota and Rauka Pernes, was that 49% of OEASA members are precarious anthropologists. And these are the people who could pay their membership fee. So imagine about the rest. But then I also was carrying out having to work, having to find another contract. So my next contract brought me to South Africa and the UK. I was hired on a contract, again, by the University of Leeds, where I was studying the digitalization and digital disruption of higher education in South Africa and the UK. There I was finding a kind of different other constellation of power. So there were, again, different actors. There are big corporations with billion-dollar income that hide behind established university brands to reap off 60 to 95% of all profit from student fees, shaved from aspiring middle classes in the global north, while they also harvest and sell big data from students. There were university senior managers that gain places on and bonuses from advisory boards and pat themselves on the shoulders for being innovative, up to speed, and employability-driven. Then there were university-hired faculty who, even before the pandemic, were working under intensifying and extensifying workloads. teaching in 3 shifts sometimes, in order to kind of do one online, one hybrid, one offline. And while at the same time, doing some courses for university and public and private company partnerships that they don't even know is being sold by the private company for money that the private company gets back. And at the same time, having to chase research income and publications to keep up the prestige that attracts fee-paying students. Many are hired increasingly sessionally under always more unbundled and obscure contract names like digital content curator, digital curriculum developer, MOOC forum moderator. And then that's not the worst part for us faculty, because there is also a reserve army of faculty who are not even hired by universities, but by the same private companies. I worked for 2 years at the University of Liverpool, and 80% of my colleagues were hired by Laureate, a private corporation, on 0-hour flat rate to supervise PhDs who get a degree from the University of Liverpool. So this is a reserve army who are not even liable to the same labor legislation as their university hire colleagues and are not unionized under the same trade unions. They're invisible, working from their bedrooms already from before the pandemic, not encouraged or supported to do research to publish, but they do the research-led teaching for research-intensive universities. But the worst part, of course, were the students. Again, students weren't on the same position within the UK and South Africa. Students at top universities are very much aware or made aware that the value of their degrees is not just the certificate, but the contract or their employability skills. But it is in the contact made with faculty and classmates and the added value of a network and community. Yet, to enjoy that privilege in face-to-face degrees, they are increasingly indebted and pushed into what David Graeber called bullshit jobs to pay their debt off. But what's worse, and this is, I know that you have been waiting to understand what the hell is this. This is a burned auditorium in South Africa at the University of Johannesburg. Students there were, when I went there for 2 fieldworks, actually in their fees must fall stage of contestation, which was not just against fees. It was for especially Black and colored students to feel citizens at the university where they were never feeling they belong. Because, for instance, some of these buildings were burned at a time when students who are on the national funding scheme, NSFAS, had not received their scholarship because it was outsourced to a private company to be paying them. So they had not received their scholarship for months, and they were sleeping rough, and they were hungry, they had gone back to their villages. They were angry. This is the type of students that these digitalized degrees are trying to target. So, I think in order here, just as an aside, and I'll come back to my main thing, we were seeing with my colleagues that this fees must fall protest cycle was really, coming back to bringing into the university this kind of political society. And the dispossessed are still in our own, they are our students, colleagues, and we can't pretend that these things don't affect us as well. And I think this is the kind of really opportune moment for anthropology, for academia, to finally get a handle of its privilege and understand that we are fighting a war. And this is a class war, and this is a war that we have to fight together. And we're not in a golden cage that is just based on merit, and we can kind of proceed into an academic career without having to not just face this reality, but live it with our skin. So, just 2 more remarks. So, in the meantime, the pandemic happened, and since the mid-2010s, I have been part of a few collectives in Bulgaria or transnational. Matan spoke earlier of LeftEast. but during the pandemic, we also established another interesting network, which is called Essential Autonomous Struggles Transnational E.A.S.T. And this was our attempt as collectives based in Eastern Europe or working with migrants from Eastern Europe and beyond to actually collect our knowledge, because many of us had started doing not just activist research with people, like on people, but rather with people from marginalized groups, many of whose predicaments they were sharing. And so this was also gradually a safe space for all of us to meet and discuss ruptures that made the social fabric of our societies and our communities ever more dismantled, and that made our activism very much also under a constant threat and rupture of conflicts, of scandals between us. And I think for now, you know, these are very baby steps again that we've been doing, but it feels like a lot of these smaller initiatives have gradually started speaking mostly to ourselves and among ourselves, and then to the West, and then to whoever there is beyond the region. And what's more, and this was part of the 1st of July mobilization that we initiated as a network, and this is the Chilean part of it, where they say, tocan a una, tocan a todas, fuera Erdogan, fuera Piñera. So if they hurt, the hurt to one is the hurt to everybody, down with Erdogan, down with Piñera. So there was a kind of interesting moment where the connection between Eastern Europe, Turkey, the East, and Latin America was made, and it was strong. And it was, for me, a kind of homecoming, bringing some of this context that I have been studying, working with, into this one image. But also, there's anthropology. And so, as Mariya said earlier, I did become the president of E.A.S.T by my surprise. I was voted with the most votes. That's how you become the president. I should not have been surprised. 49% of all anthropologists are precarious, and I was one of the people that run on an anti-precarity platform. But I think, and that was, initially this was announced as a presidential address, you know, the way that I can see a learned society as E.A.S.T active is that, you know, especially with anthropology, we now really need to use this power structure that is so kind of marginal still, but, you know, has some gravity, to expose power structures and oppressions at home, in our institutions, at the university, in academia, and not just abroad. And to put an end to the invisibility and silent individual suffering, and to fight for our rights as collective of workers sharing vulnerabilities and strengths. So I think it is high time that learned societies as E.A.S.T make an active political stance, and also not just as a possibility, but as a demand and necessity from our disciplines. And that is something that the Applied Anthropology Network has taken up seriously this year, and we are all here to celebrate their effort. Thank you. This was just to say, this picture that disappeared is made by Ali Turnus, who is a Turkish, it's a picture of, Belgrade. And he did his PhD in anthropology in Brno. So there is your connection.